Hello and welcome to Epiphytic Cacti. Today we are going to go through the entire genus of Rhipsalis and we are going to rank them based off of how common or how rare they are in the United States. So we're going to go with basically like box store common, which would be like if I went to any big store in the United States that sold plants, like maybe Home Depot, chances are I might find this in there. And then we'll go with common. The tricksy thing about Rhipsalis is that they don't have the same sort of common status as other plants would. So when you're talking about other plants and you're, like Hoya, common Hoya, that means that it's been widely cultivated. And by widely cultivated, I mean that you would be able to find it in a store. When we're talking about Rhipsalis, it's kind of not the case because Rhipsalis really aren't widely cultivated with the exception of the handful that you might find in the big box store. They're not widely cultivated. And so when we're talking about common, we're talking about something that's in a lot of people's collections that you might find sold online. So you might find it on eBay or Etsy, or you might find it on like Steve's Leaves or, someplace like that. Like a larger kind of nursery, maybe. Or one that specializes more in cacti, really. And then we'll look at uncommon. Uncommon means more along the lines of like you might find it posted online. So you might find it on your eBays or your Etsy's or even like your Steve's Leaves or, someplace like that. But not very often. So it's something that only comes up every once in a while. So if you want it, you're really going to have to work to try to get it to some degree. And then we'll look at rare. And rare might be something where if you want it, you are either going to have to go find someone who is a private seller who has it and ask them for it. Or you might have to import it from another country. That's something to kind of note right here because a lot of plants, like a lot of our epiphytic cacti or Rhipsalis that we think are rare in the United States are not rare in European countries. So, there's a gentleman that comments a lot on my stuff and he's from France and it's always kind of comical because he talks about how they have these big hanging baskets of some of these plants in France. And people just don't buy them, but they're there. They're commonly available, which in the United States, a big hanging basket of any Rhipsalis is going to set you back something. Even a common one, especially if it's a big mature one, it will set you back something. So that would be rare. And, you might catch it online, but you would have to be super lucky. And that it has happened to me a few times. I have gotten extremely lucky, but we're talking about rare. It's going to be really tough to get. And then we're going to go with your firstborn child. So we're going to talk about Rhipsalis that you're only going to get if you make a pact with Rumpelstiltskin for your firstborn child and can spin strong to gold and all of that stuff and make a wish for, a very specific Rhipsalis, because that's about the only way that you're going to get it. That's not entirely true, but there are some of them that are so rare that you won't see them online. It would be like a miracle if you did see them available anywhere. And so about your only option to get any of those, really, you need to have friends in special places kind of thing. It's a really sad thing because I think that, in the United States, there are a lot of Rhipsalis that we can't get, or the only way that we would be able to get is if we had, a special friend who had a special friend in Europe. Do you see what I'm saying? They would be really hard to get. And I don't think that Europeans necessarily face the same issue with this because generally there are places that do distribute them in Europe, but in the United States, that's just not the case. And so some of those places at one time would allow imports into the United States usually it was just through some sort of person that they selected to do the imports kind of thing. But, since COVID and I think the way that a lot of things have kind of gone, that's not really, I don't think that's a thing anymore that they really import. So yeah, some of them are just firstborn child kind of rare. So without further ado, let's get started. The first one we're going to look at is Rhipsalis agudoensis. This one is from Brazil. It has generally like 3 to 5 angled branches. Now, this is kind of a weird thing because a lot of times whenever they kind of protrude out, we call them wings. So we might call those like 3 wings or 5 wings. There's growth on here where it's actually 2 angled. There's quite a bit of it, to be honest. In terms of rarity, this one is going to come in at, I would say, uncommon. This one might be kind of teetering between uncommon and rare. And the only reason why I would say that is because I think that due to a lack of popularity, this one is a little bit harder to get. Not necessarily because it's genuinely rare. But I have seen it available in the United States. I have seen it come up every once in a while online. And I think if you were to go into maybe a Facebook Rhipsalis group and you were like, I'm looking for Rhipsalis agudoensis, chances are someone would be like, I have that. And next up is Rhipsalis aurea. Now, aurea is Latin for golden or gold. And you'll generally hear it being used along with variegated or variegata. So you'll see things that are like Aurea variegata, and literally that's just a very, very fancy way of saying yellow variegated. This one has this name because the flower is bright yellow. Bright yellow, kind of like Hadioura salicornioides flowers. Bright yellow. It even kind of resembles Hadioura salicornioides. Recently, there was another discovery, I believe it came out of Japan. A hybrid was created between Hadioura salicornioides and Rhipsalis cereuscula. Through that kind of discovery, it was speculated that perhaps Rhipsalis aurea was a natural hybrid in the wild from Hadioura salicornioides and another Rhipsalis. It's a beautiful plant. Obviously, you can see that I have a twig that is in some substrate, and I am having difficulties with rooting this plant, which does not strike me as surprising. Like, if it really is, a natural hybrid with Hadioura salicornioides, some of those aren't the easiest to root. So perhaps, but this one grows in Brazil, and it's got a beautiful, beautiful sort of like hanging habit and the most gorgeous little yellow flowers. Oh man. But the rarity on this one is really your firstborn child. This is one that you will not see sold online in stores. Like you can't even hardly find pictures posted from people in the US. Like it's in very few private collections in the United States. And like I said, literally it's like a weird thing where you got to know someone who knows someone who knows someone kind of thing. That's not the case in Europe though. You can get it if you are in Europe fairly easily. So in the United States, this one's rarity is classified as your firstborn child. Next up, we have Rhipsalis Baccifera, subspecies Baccifera. So there are a lot of Baccifera, and they are all very, very confusing. So I do think that this is the one that we see more commonly than any of the others. I don't know that I've ever really seen this in a big box store, so I don't think it's big box store common, but I definitely think that it is common. I could definitely go on Etsy, I could definitely go on eBay, and I could definitely find this plant. So I feel like this is kind of one that it's weird because it is very common, but I think it's one that doesn't have the same sort of popularity necessarily as a lot of the other Rhipsalis. So that's a little bit sad because they are fun. These are the ones that like turn into these big, like crazy dangly monster plants. Now, it gets highly confused with a lot of other plants. So unfortunately, more often than not, when you purchase a Rhipsalis, I have found that there are so many of Rhipsalis Baccifera that are being sold under different names, wrong names. So I think it's very good to sort of see this plant, see what it looks like, and then, you know, be able to kind of, I guess, inform yourself that when you're shopping around, sort of the differences. So one of the obvious differences, because I think that this guy is so commonly confused for Rhipsalis terrace, different forms of Rhipsalis terrace, but one of the ways that you can tell specifically with this is that it's new growth. It has a tendency to be pointed instead of rounded, and that is not the case for Rhipsalis terrace. You'll also see there's a different kind of growth pattern here. These guys get a little bit longer. Anyway, they do have whorls, like there's 3 whorls on there, there's 2 there. So you can see it does that. They have a tendency to be a little bit longer, like this. And sometimes they shoot out big crazy ones. Like you can see this one looks like it's got 6 whorls at the end there. And sometimes they shoot out big crazy ones like this, just off at a random angle, and they'll shoot off some whorls there. And the top of this plant, you know, you could, like I said, you can see these guys, which are just kind of like, we're just going to kind of grow out a little bit weird like that. So commonly confused for other things. Also one that commonly gets a lot of corking at the bottom of the branches. This is just corking. It's usually like a scar, just with age, you know, it'll become kind of woody. Sun can cause corking. You know, here again, you see this kind of odd thing growing out kind of wildly, and there you see the whorls again. So yeah, this one would definitely be classified as common. And next up, we have Rhipsalis Baccifera, subspecies Cleistogama. So you notice that the table is empty here. That's because even if I had it, I don't know if I would know that I had it. So I don't necessarily think that this one, I can't really classify this one. So we're going to kind of have to go right in the middle here, because I'm sure that it is out there, and I'm sure that a lot of people have it. Just like most of the subspecies of Baccifera, I feel like they are widely spread because they are very easy growing. But the issue with Baccifera is in knowing what they are. So it's quite difficult, I think, to determine the subspecies for some of them. So this one particularly is very difficult to determine because, as its name says, it has flowers that are cleistogamous. And what that means is that they don't really open, because what happens is when the flower is forming inside of the flower bud, it pollinates itself. And once you pollinate a flower, it generally dies very quickly. So you never really get to see the flower. So what you see is something that will form a bud, and every part of the flower structure will look very much like your typical Rhipsalis Baccifera flowers, but it will just never open. This one also has red berries. We are not going to classify this one as anything other than we're just going to go right down the middle, and we're just going to be like, it's uncommon. And we're only going to say that because chances are you're not going to go on the internet and type the subspecies name Cleistogama in and find anything. Chances are you won't even find pictures. So chances are you can't find anyone with a real positive ID on this one, except for in, you know, you would actually have to go to, I think, like a conservatory or something to get a positive identification on this plant. So that's one of the issues with Rhipsalis. So there you go. We're going to have to classify this one as uncommon. So next up we have Rhipsalis Baccifera subspecies Erythrocarpa. This is kind of going to fall into the same issue as your other Baccifera. Again, I think we have to classify it as uncommon, mostly because I don't really think you can classify it on site, and most people are just going to try to distribute it under the name Rhipsalis Baccifera and drop the subspecies, particularly in the United States. It probably looks very like this plant. This plant might be it. I won't actually know. And I won't really know until this plant tries to form fruit. So until it flowers and until it tries to form fruit, and this plant has flowered, but it hasn't tried to form fruit. But once it tries to form fruit, generally I will be able to tell, because the fruit will start out red and then it will kind of fade. So that's generally about the only way that you can classify these. And like I said, unfortunately, particularly in the United States, I think that Rhipsalis baccifera is just called Rhipsalis baccifera. It's not usually given the subspecies name. So for the same reason that it's probably widely available, but it's just very, very hard to know which one you have, we have to call this uncommon. And next up, we have Rhipsalis baccifera, subspecies Horrida. So this plant drives me a little bit bananas. So I see this plant listed under all kinds of messed up common names. There's a whole entire different genus out there, which is Aurea. The Aurea genus, a lot of times they were commonly called rat-tail cactus. Now this one, because it was generally softer and smaller, someone gave it the common name Mousetail Cactus. And so the problem with this is that I have since also seen this particular plant listed with the name rat-tail cactus. So this is kind of highlights the really big issue with common names. And here's the thing, like, it's really kind of our responsibility to go around and correct those names. Videos like this, or, when you put your plants online and you put them with a name, not really putting the common name, or just kind of putting the common name as like a weird side note after the plant or whatever, can really help with that kind of thing. Because the more you see the proper name, the more likely people are to use it. And I know that's kind of a crazy thing, but I think that different people have differing opinions about this. And personally, just like when we went over the Baccifera, the previous Baccifera that we've gone over, we can't even really tell the difference, and we wouldn't know what we had because they're just so commonly distributed as Baccifera instead of having the subspecies afterwards. And unfortunately, what happens with that is if you are trying to conserve plants, that kind of thing becomes an issue, and you will lose plants to improper naming. And we'll see some of that later on. So this one, please, if you have this, please put in parentheses after the proper name, which is Rhipsalis baccifera, subspecies Horrida. You can put parentheses Mousetail Cactus. It also helps all those people out there who bought their plant as Mousetail Cactus know what the real species is. That's just my 2 cents on that. This one is just kind of a tiny baby one. These get much, much longer. And you can definitely tell the difference between this one and a Aurea cactus, because if I did this to an Aurea cactus, I would be screaming. Aurea cactus have very sharp spines. This one, as the name suggests, that common name, it's soft. I can touch it, it's soft. This is pretty stiff. These get pretty long, and they will just get covered in those beautiful little white Baccifera flowers. I love those little white Baccifera flowers. So they'll just pop out all over along the areoles on these branches. So cool. And this is also, so I have another one that's got a much bigger one, but see this? This is also one that will crest. So it's one of the ones that will more, like, in terms of cresting, it's one that more commonly will crest. Because again, these are cacti. So they're cacti. They are genuinely cacti. They're not anything other than cacti. So this one is interesting because this one is big box store common. You can definitely in the United States find this plant in a big box store. Chances are you won't find it under its proper name, though. You might find it under the name Mousetail. You might find it under the name, 2-inch succulent. So that's another thing. I get very upset when I see like the succulent thing. It's just like how lazy could you be? So now everybody is running around with 2-inch, 3-inch, 4-inch succulents, but they're like, I don't know what plant I have. And you should see the droves of people that come into like the Facebook groups and stuff and are like, I need an ID. And it's always these super common ones that they're finding in the big box stores because they just don't put IDs on them, usually. But so this one is definitely big box store common. A crested version, though, not so much. A crested version will be rare. Next up, we have Rhipsalis Baccifera, subspecies Mauritiana. What's interesting about this plant is where it grows. This one grows in Africa, in tropical Africa, so I think that's interesting about this one. This one also has a different kind of habit, I think, sort of from a lot of the other Baccifera. Like a lot of the other Baccifera that we looked at, particularly the first ones, they had this like long pendulous habit. And while this one does have that, it's a little bit more stout about it and a little messier about it. So this one is one that I commonly see confused with the terrace. But again, you know, same thing with this one. The new growth on these guys, or just the ends of these whorls, the terminal ends on these, will generally be a little bit more pointy. This one is the one that you very commonly see listed as, it's like something Ferrari or something like that. I see it quite often. This will blush very, very, very red if you put it in the sun. And even the new growth where it's not that setting here is kind of red. And it does a couple of other annoying things. And I say annoying only because it can make this very difficult to distinguish between other species. So because this new growth was put in the sun and everything, unfortunately, one of the things that we see here is the reddening at the areoles, and the areoles are very prominent. So that can make this plant, especially cuttings of this plant, end up being very confused with some other plants. You know, it could be confused. It's unlikely because of the growth difference, but it is possible that it could be confused with Rhipsalis puniciodiscus. It could be confused with the standard form of Rhipsalis nevis armandii, and the duller segments can be confused with Rhipsalis terrace. So you can see that this has kind of white berries. There's some reddish around the base and there's some red around the tips. The berries are quite large. They're not small berries by any stretch of the imagination. Like some of the other ones have smaller berries. This one has big ones. It's a beautiful plant. And like I said, with the other ones, they kind of grow more pendulous. This one has like this, it's going to be pendulous for sure. It's not totally like this, but it has a quasi-bushing kind of habit. In terms of rarity for this one would be classified as somewhere between big box store common and common. Very easy to find. It is really, really easy to find this one under its subspecies name. Next up, we have Rhipsalis Barthlottii, or Rhipsalis barthlottii. This one is also a fairly new discovery. And because this one is a fairly new discovery, it is definitely going to be on the much, much rarer side. This one also grows in Brazil. And unfortunately, this is just such a mess with these guys. All these ones that kind of grow like this, they get so mixed up and they get so confused for each other. And this one I think is going to fall in there because it definitely looks like some of the others, but it has a very, very, very yellow flower. So you can't really confuse this with anything else if it has flowered. So this, it's not something like in the United States, I guarantee you it would be a miracle if you accidentally had this one in your collection. A miracle. So like I said, because it was generally more recently discovered, very hard to get in the United States, the classification on this one would be somewhere between your firstborn child and rare. It's pretty hard to get generally. I think there are a few private collections in the United States that have it, so it is getting a little bit more distributed, which is why I'm going to put it, you know, somewhere between your firstborn child and rare, because it is in the United States, and with some poking around at private collectors, you might be able to get your hands on it. But very interesting, you know, I still think it's like wildly interesting that they're still making, you know, discoveries, that they're still finding Rhipsalis in the wild. So super cool. Next up, we have Rhipsalis Burchellii, or Rhipsalis burchellii. And this one also grows in Brazil. You notice the pattern there? Most of these grow in Brazil. So this one is kind of a goofy one, because for this one, highly confused with Rhipsalis Campos-portoana, to the point that the plants look so similar that for positive identification, you need to wait for the berries. So the plant that you have in front of you, it could be Rhipsalis burchellii. I bought it under the name Rhipsalis burchellii, but I don't really know if the person that I got it from really saw the berries. You know, I didn't see pictures of the berries that they took off of their parent plant, so I don't really know. So that just kind of leaves me hanging out, waiting for this to flower, and then waiting for berries. And it has flowered, but I find this to be slightly problematic in my collection, that the berries do not always take. They don't always get fertilized, and so sometimes I don't really have berries. I think that, note to self, next year, you know, I'll have to go around hand pollinating them. So this might be Rhipsalis burchellii, it might not be Rhipsalis burchellii. In terms of rarity for Rhipsalis burchellii, I think we're going to have to go with somewhere between uncommon and rare. And the only reason why we're doing that is because I can go online right now. I can go on Etsy, I can go on eBay, I can go type in Rhipsalis burchellii, and I can definitely buy this plant in the United States. But I don't know if it will actually be Rhipsalis burchellii. So I have to wait for a while to figure that out until it fruits. And I can tell you right now, I see way more Rhipsalis Campos-portoana being distributed in the United States than Rhipsalis burchellii. We're going to have to call it somewhere between uncommon and rare, just because in order for me to get a completely and totally confirmed Rhipsalis burchellii, it would mean that I would need to go to probably a private collector who has a confirmed identification to absolutely, positively get this plant. And next up, we have Rhipsalis Campos-portoana. So this is actually, I believe that this is my first ever Rhipsalis that I purchased. And I purchased it, it was funny because it looked like a chia pet. It was just like these two weird clumps of like chia pet looking thing, and then it grew into this giant monster plant. So this one has a soft spot for me. This one has bloomed, it has set fruit, the fruit is orange, so I can positively say that this is Rhipsalis Campos-portoana. In terms of rarity for this plant, I would put it as uncommon. I believe that maybe there are a few places in the United States where you might be able to find it in a big box store, but I think more often than not, you're going to have to go online and you're going to have to look for Rhipsalis Campos-portoana. So, like I said, this one, for some strange reason, is more positively ID'd than Rhipsalis burchellii. Not really sure why that is the case, but it is the case. So this one, it's more likely that's the plant you have, but like I said, you can't hardly tell them apart. Even whenever they bloom, you just really can't tell them apart very well. So definitely wait for those berries. Orange berries, Rhipsalis Campos-portoana. Reddish berries, Rhipsalis burchellii. Next up, we have Rhipsalis cereoides. So, also grows in Brazil. Shocker, I know. And this one is interesting because it is epiphytic. Every once in a while you get the odd kid that is not actually epiphytic. It's more epiphytic. It's growing on rocks and stuff. So, because of that, definitely can tell you one thing instantly about this plant. It doesn't like to be overwatered. So you want it to be very, very, very well draining. So this one's kind of a weird one because it's hard to confuse with something else once you've seen it in person. You know, it generally has like 3 to 4 angled branches. It's very, very, very stiff. Very, very stiff. Generally pretty sturdy, and the angles on this, they are sharp angles. So there's no softness to these angles whatsoever. It can get really cool. It can sort of get really pendant and, you know, strongly jointed. So it'll just kind of like hang down, cascade beautifully on the joints. I really only have this little tiny one. In terms of rarity for this one, this one's uncommon. If you want this one, you're definitely going to have to go online to get it. So you would definitely just go like Etsy, eBay, you know, search for Rhipsalis cereoides, or you can go to Facebook and, Facebook groups ask for it. So I do think it's one that's not grown quite as much as some of the other ones, like in terms of, I think one of the reasons why it might be uncommon and not more common is just genuinely because it's not one that I think that commonly people choose to grow. If that makes any sense. It's just not that popular for people to grow. Next up, we have Rhipsalis Cereuscula. So this one grows in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay. So that should tell you something about this. It grows well. It's definitely one that's growing well in a lot of different places. So in terms of classification for this one is indeed big box store common. So you definitely, I see this in big box stores a lot. Usually you'll just sort of see these little guys planted here, and then all of a sudden it will kind of go, bah! This is really like a wildly crazy growing plant. This plant, for being really common, it's interesting because I think that it has very beautiful flowers and it's got really curious little fruits. So definitely one that I would say, even though it's super common, fun to have in your collection because it is very fun growing, fun to watch grow, fun to watch bloom, so sometimes some of these plants end up being, cultivated and grown in the big box stores. Like we found out it grows in a lot of different places, meaning it's probably very easy to grow. So it's somewhat lucrative for them to actually sell it in big box stores. It's different. I think there was like a succulent craze. And once again, these are cacti. But a lot of times you will see it sold under that, same like 2-inch succulent, 4-inch succulent kind of thing. So super common, super common, super easy to get a hold of. You could go online right now, eBay, Etsy, you could look for it and find it absolutely no problem. It's really, really easy to identify because of this kind of strange growth pattern that it has here. And these will be round. So the only other plant that I ever see this one commonly confused for is Rhipsalis terrariform prismatica. But again, prismatica has angled segments, so should be very easy to tell apart. Next up, we have Rhipsalis clavata, form clavata. So this is the more standard form, the one that has clades that are a little bit thicker. There you go. I mean, it still has a bunch of thin clades on it, which is kind of weird, but it also has these kind of thicker, shorter kind of clumping clades. So this one we are going to classify in terms of availability in the United States. I feel like this one we need to classify as rare. So I'll expand on that just a little bit because it seems strange, because I know that if you go online and you start looking for Rhipsalis clavata, you can find a lot of Rhipsalis clavata. But the thing about it is that most of them aren't the standard form. So most of them are the other form, which we will look at in just a minute. So I would definitely classify this one as rare. I think it's a little bit harder to get a hold of. I think you can get it. I think you can get lucky online and find it. I got lucky and found this one on Etsy, but it took a long time before I got lucky and found it on Etsy. So this is one that I think that if you really want it, your best bet is probably to go on Facebook and maybe do an in search of post, or keep an eye out really close online. You really have to look really closely at the plant's clades because it's so much more often that you're going to find the other form. You might want to start maybe looking at private collectors and, asking private collectors. So yeah, Rhipsalis clavata, form clavata, I would definitely classify as rare. Next up, Rhipsalis clavata, form Delicatula. Now, Delicatula, I would classify Delicatula as uncommon. So this is one, though, that unfortunately I would classify it as common if it was ever sold under its correct name. I think that unfortunately it has, someone made a wild guess once and decided to call it Rhipsalis Capilliformis. And unfortunately, I think that was someone who was more of a distributor who quite commonly sold them. And most people, when they buy a plant, they will, take it on faith that whatever the name is of the plant that they purchased is the correct name. That is definitely not the case with Rhipsalis. So somehow Rhipsalis clavata form Delicatula ended up more commonly being called Rhipsalis capilliformis. And that's really sad, but you can commonly find it under that name. But it is uncommon to find it under its correct name. So the difference, like I said, kind of the difference between this one and the standard form is that these clades, they are just thinner and more delicate, hence the name Delicatula. It's just a little more delicate. I do find this plant is a little bit of a diva in terms of growing. I mean, it doesn't really look like it. It grows super fast and it grows super well, but I do notice that this one is a little bit more temperamental in terms of dropping clades if it gets too cold, too warm, underwatered, overwatered, that kind of thing. So it is definitely living up to its name of being a little more delicate. Beautiful, beautiful plant though, and very easy to identify just on site, even on its its flowers. It's very, very easy to identify. So unfortunately, it is common, but we have to classify it as uncommon. Next up, we have Rhipsalis crispata. Now, Rhipsalis crispata, I would definitely classify as common. Now, this one is kind of interesting because unfortunately, you do see this one being sold under a whole bunch of different names, which is really sad because this one is the one that I would say is the most easy to identify on site. It definitely just looks different. It's kind of hard to explain, but it just genuinely looks different. It has a different growth habit. Like, notice how this has this kind of like long sort of slender segment here, and then it's got growth that's coming out of the sides on this. That's a different kind of growth habit from most of these types with these sort of flat clades. These clades are a little bit smaller. You can see how it kind of like twists and stuff like that. It's new growth. It just kind of has a different color always. It's like a little bit of a sort of a lighter greenish color. Its new growth is always kind of this cute sort of pinkish looking color. It's just one that's really easy to identify on site. This plant, I'm definitely going to have to say is common. I feel like I could go online very easily and find this plant, again, because generally for most collectors, it is one, like serious collectors, it is one that is very easy to identify on site versus some of the other ones that we'll get into here. Next up, let's take a look at Rhipsalis cuneata. Now, this I unboxed in my recent unboxing. I had to import this from Germany. Since I imported it from Germany, I had since seen this plant listed for sale on Etsy for the first time in years. And I really don't quite know what this plant is supposed to look like. Like, I've looked at pictures of it and stuff, and most of these kind of small flat clade Rhipsalis, they have a tendency without any flowers or blooms or anything like that to just kind of get all muddied. I have seen pictures where it, kind of looks like this, but there are other plants that I have that kind of look like this. And this is the one that I found on Etsy. And then this one is the one that I imported from Germany. I'm more likely to believe that this one is correct. And both of these might be correct, and they just look a little bit different, grown under different conditions. Maybe they're different clones. I don't really know. But in terms of the rarity classification for this one, I think because I can't easily find it, if I search online, if I search Facebook, if I'm just looking for Rhipsalis cuneata, it might be really difficult for me to find pictures. So given that, and given the fact that I can't purchase it in the United States, save for if I went, if I started going down the path of in search ofs, trying to get, trying to find it in private collections type of thing. But the fact that I could import it, but even then I'm not super sure that it's correct. I think we would have to go with rare for this one. So it might even be between like rare and your firstborn child, but closer to the rare side. Next up, we have Rhipsalis Dissimilis form Dissimilis. Now, this is kind of a crazy thing about this plant because, interestingly enough, there is kind of this issue with this plant where there's these two forms, that are kind of like floating around in the United States. Well, really there's one form floating around in the United States a little more commonly. And so that is supposed to be Rhipsalis Dissimilis form Mauritiana or Mauritianum, and it was reduced to being a synonym of Rhipsalis Dissimilis form Dissimilis. And so you can see that the growth pattern for these is here. And you can see that it is really interesting. Like, I just got this one from Cactine Hage, and I'm still totally blown away with the appearance of this plant. Like, if we look at this plant, and this is desiccated, so these ribs from traveling, so these ribs are a lot more interesting. But look at how fascinating that is. I mean, it looks like Rhipsalis paradoxa-ish. It's just so fascinating. Yeah, so this one has that. It's just very interesting, and it's such an interesting specimen of this. So if we get down in the base, though, we can see kind of that 5-angled growth that this one is generally known for. It's supposed to have a lot more angles, really kind of like 5 to 9 ribs on it, which is interesting because that Mauritianum form didn't really. So here's another Mauritianum, and this one again, looks a little bit different. This one has a lot more rooted, so the ribs are definitely not showing quite as much, and you can see there's kind of a rounded appearance here. And here you can see right here, particularly on this one, the growth that has more like 5 ribs. So, and then some of the growth here where you can see it's just kind of completely rounded off. So generally, that would be kind of that form. And then we have this one. And I'm still kind of confused about this one. So again, here we can see this growth where it's got, about 5 ribs there. But most of the growth on this appears to be considerably more round. And then it has a lot of these little growths that are coming up like this. So my assumption on this is that, and this is an assumption, that it is Rhipsalis Dissimilis form Dissimilis, but it was the more classic form. I don't think that this is Rhipsalis Dissimilis form Epiphyllanthoides, but eventually we'll find out because the flower is a different color. So yeah, in any case, the rarity of this one, and we're going to kind of split the difference between these two because you can get Rhipsalis Dissimilis form Mauritianum. You can get that older form that was reduced to being a synonym of form Dissimilis. This one a little bit less. This particular kind of clone a little bit less. So I would say that in the United States, we're going to call this one rare. I have seen it available on Etsy, so chances are if you go search on Etsy right now, you'll probably find it. I definitely know that I've seen it in quite a few collections more recently. I think a lot of people don't know what it is. I think it's mistaken for Trigona, particularly the Mauritiana form. It's mistaken for Trigona a lot. And here we have Rhipsalis Dissimilis form Epiphyllanthoides. I once said that if I had this plant, when I did my top 10 favorite Rhipsalis, that if I had this plant, it would be in there, but I didn't think that I would ever have this plant. By some miracle, this year I managed to get a handful of plants I just never thought I would ever have. This is just one of them. I think this plant is so cool. The way that this plant grows is very different, I think, from a lot of other Rhipsalis because it grows like on clusters of rocks. It's more epilithic, and it will just kind of grow straight up in like these really funny, like straight up clusters of these kind of growths that are like this. Much like the other one that we were looking at where I wasn't totally positive if it was form Dissimilis or if it was some variation on this one. It will also has a tendency to get those kind of caterpillary growths at the end. Super, super freaking cool. And I really, really, really was excited to have this one specifically because what it allowed me to do was actually do a comparison with the other ones. And there were so many cool things. So look at the big prominent red scales. You can see that when I got this one and it was more desiccated, it was super cool because you could see the same similar patterning on the ribbing and the same kind of segmentation in different parts of the growth on Form Marierianum. So cool. So one of the big differences between these, I mean, obviously they grow just a wee bit different. You know, this one growing super erect, the other form, Marierianum, or Dissimilis, growing very cascading. But one of the coolest differences is that the flower on this one is bright yellow and it's pretty big. So that is just fantastic. In terms of rarity on this one, I think we're definitely going to have to go, somewhere between your firstborn child and rare. So I don't think we can totally say your firstborn child, even though I know for a fact that there are private collectors in the United States that have this. So I know that there is a possibility of getting it in the United States from a private collector versus having to get it from some obscure place in Europe. So I know that that is the case. And so yes, we're definitely going to classify this one as somewhere between your firstborn child and rare. And now let's take a look at Rhipsalis elliptica. This is, again, I'm fairly sure that this is elliptica, but I'm not totally positive. So it bloomed. Like I said, I think the biggest problem with these is that there is no real positive identification available. I think that unfortunately they are subject to just having been someone looking at them and deciding that it was one of many similar Rhipsalis that look like this. And it's kind of down to, I think, having it in your collection, growing a lot of them, seeing the flowers, seeing the growth patterns, up close in person, seeing those clade shapes and seeing the growth, and then seeing the fruit set. I have not seen the fruit set on this, even though it did bloom. It didn't really set fruit, so that was a little problematic. But I am generally pretty confident that this is Rhipsalis elliptica. Now, you can see the growth pattern. I did a video on this, and you can see the growth pattern here is somewhat different. It's not necessarily full-on straight down cascading. It's got kind of this funny, let's grow out like this, down and out, so it can be kind of a wide plant. In terms of rarity, you can get this one. I can go on the internet right now, and I can type in, Rhipsalis elliptica on almost any of those sites, or even some commercial nursery sites. And I will find something that has that name. I'm not sure it'll be correct, though. I do think this one has a tendency to be a little bit more correct than some of the other ones, though. So in terms of rarity, I think that we're going to go with uncommon in this one, even though I think that it probably might be a little bit more common. We're going to go with uncommon just because of the fact that it is so frequently mislabeled. And next up, we are going to look at Rhipsalis Ewaldiana. Now, this might be Ewaldiana. I don't quite know because that has not bloomed yet. And interestingly enough, I got this under what is quite possibly the most ridiculous name ever. And again, I think that sometimes this becomes kind of complicated because I think that sometimes whenever it comes to Rhipsalis identification, more weight is put on the berry color than should be. Here's the thing. When it comes to this, it's not necessarily like a hard and fast rule all the time for everything. So when it comes to some things like Rhipsalis Campos-portoana versus Rhipsalis Burchellii, that is tried and true, super common. We've never really seen different colors on the berries, so we know that. So when we say that, we can be absolutely certain. There are some other plants, though, some other Rhipsalis, where you more commonly see them with one color of berry, but they can have another color of berry. So sometimes, unfortunately, someone will have one of these and then it will bloom, and then it will set fruit, and they'll be like, oh, but the berry color doesn't necessarily match. And then they'll just make up some name for it, which is what happened to this. So I think it's Rhipsalis Ewaldiana, not entirely sure, but I'm sure that I have Rhipsalis Ewaldiana somewhere in my collection. I just need to wait for it to bloom and then set fruit to be certain. So Rhipsalis Ewaldiana, in terms of rarity classification, we will go with uncommon. I think that it is probably common, but I think that, just like the last one, we're going to come into a situation of, probably being mislabeled Rhipsalis sulcata, or like this one, honestly, this was labeled Rhipsalis elliptica. Yeah, like some wild form of Rhipsalis elliptica. So yeah, that's just kind of the nature of Rhipsalis. But yeah, we'll definitely go with that. I think that's a good solid classification for this one, uncommon. Next up, we have Rhipsalis Flagelliformis. This one also grows in Brazil. This is another one where it is a generally fairly new species, so it's not exactly Mr. Distributed yet. I don't know how distributed it will get, to be honest. So obviously it is a very different looking Rhipsalis, and I'm sure that the species Cactus Flagelliformis. Well, now we have Rhipsalis Flagelliformis. So obviously it has that same kind of growth pattern. It will get very long. It will be very pendant. It's a very different kind of Rhipsalis. It's really interesting though, because this will get little tiny Rhipsalis blooms all down those areoles. Super cool. So in terms of Rhipsalis, you could never, it would be so hard to misidentify this Rhipsalis. And again, if you think you have this in your collection, chances are probably not. Again, it would be an absolute miracle if you did. So because this one, given the fact that it is a fairly new species, given the fact that it is in some US collections, but very few, this one is definitely one that is going to have a rarity classification of your firstborn child. I also suspect that this is probably going to be a Rhipsalis that is going to be a little bit harder to grow than some of the other Rhipsalis. Mostly because that is the same sort of for the Aurea cactus. It's going to have those ribs, it's got the spines. For people that don't know, the epiphytic cacti, whenever they transition to being epiphytic, over time, this kind of thing would have happened. They dropped a few things. So they dropped their ribs mostly, and they dropped their spines. That's why most of them don't have a whole lot of spines. This one, still maintaining ribs and spines, you could better believe this one is going to be kind of a difficult one in terms of watering, because it's going to store more water. And so it's going to have to be watered a little bit less and treated a little bit differently. And because of those spines and because of those ribs, I can almost guarantee that it's going to want to have more sunlight than a typical Rhipsalis. And interestingly, I read this and I never really totally knew what the purpose of the spines were. I knew that in terms of your desert cacti, that it would be to ward off predators and stuff. But I read this recently and I thought that it was kind of a funny thing that one of the other purposes behind those spines was to provide the cacti with some shade. So that if your cacti has a lot of spines like that, it is definitely one that appreciates more light. So super cool note there. Definitely have to classify it definitely as your firstborn child. So next up we have Rhipsalis Floccosa, and we will be looking at subspecies Floccosa. So this one is also grows in Brazil, and this one, a lot of these are a little hard to tell apart without the flower. So the flower on this one is supposed to be kind of a greenish white color. So that should be kind of helpful. There are some distinct things that I've noticed about some of them, like this one particularly has these very sort of strong little reddish scales on it. So, but it can also have kind of slightly different forms. So I have a lot of this plant, a lot of this. I have a lot of Rhipsalis floccosa, as in subspecies Floccosa. And what I can say about this is that there is a lot of variation in different clones. So it's a little bit difficult from that perspective, but it grows this beautiful, I mean, you can see how beautiful this is. Rhipsalis floccosa, like any subspecies of Floccosa, is really something that I think is fantastic. One of my favorites, but it's going to grow down and just keep hanging. It's one that's going to get real long because it's going to keep growing segments out of the segments, and it'll just get really long and beautiful. And it has flowers that are a little bit larger and a little bit more showy. So in terms of rarity for this one, we are going to have to, I think we're going to have to drop this one in probably somewhere between rare and uncommon. So you can find this in the United States. Like if you go on Etsy or eBay and you do some searching, it's not going to come up very often, but it will come up. The issue with this is whether or not it is truly the subspecies Floccosa. So the issue is that you might find several Rhipsalis floccosa, but chances are you probably are not going to get the proper subspecies. So it's going to take, you getting several of them and then, getting them to bloom and getting them, mature and everything before you can determine what is really what there. And if you want to get it from a really reputable source, like you'd have to go to a private collector, you'd have to go through that whole spiel. So you have to call it somewhere between uncommon and rare for that reason. The next one is going to be Rhipsalis floccosa subspecies Agudoensis. Now that is one heck of a mouthful. This one grows in Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. And it apparently has a yellow flower bud. So this is one of these things where I have never seen this plant anywhere. And if you go online and you start doing some searching, chances are it will take you at least an hour to find a picture that might actually be correct. So is it around? I have absolutely no idea. Like I said, I have tons and tons and tons of plants that are Rhipsalis floccosa. Is it possible that one of those many plants that I have is Rhipsalis floccosa subspecies Agudoensis? Perhaps. But perhaps not. I don't actually know. You can see by the beautiful white table where there is nothing there. So in terms of habit, it will have a similar habit to, and it will probably even have a similar appearance to Rhipsalis floccosa subspecies Floccosa. In terms of rarity on this one, it's very difficult to classify because I kind of feel like the only place that you could get this from, you might be able to find it from a private collector, maybe, but I think it is more likely that you would have to go to a conservatory to even see one, and to see one that is correct. So I would guess that it is only in a handful of collections, confirmed, and that it is more likely to be in conservatories. So because of that, and because I don't totally know and I'm not totally confident, I think we're going to have to go with your firstborn child. Between your firstborn child and rare, we're going to have to go there with this one. And you will see the table is also blank on this one. So we're going to go with, the next one is Rhipsalis floccosa subspecies Aurea. And same thing. If you try to find this, chances are it's going to be hard to find pictures positively. The flowers on this one are supposed to be a little bit smaller than they are on any of the other subspecies in Floccosa. So, once again, we have the beautiful blank table because we don't know. And I feel like you would have to really, truly, very few private collections confirmed, and, once again, a conservatory. So, we can kind of get into it about the issue with Floccosa a little bit, is that I think that either there just wasn't a lot of availability or there wasn't a lot of interest in terms of why it doesn't seem to be too cultivated. Both of those things are possibilities. I'm not sure why, because I think they're absolutely gorgeous and wonderful, and those flowers are just fantastic. But yeah, so for Rhipsalis Floccosa subspecies Oreophila, we're going to have to go with a rarity classification of between your firstborn child and rare. And next up is Rhipsalis Floccosa subspecies Pulvingera. Now, this is really interesting because, again, you see that there is just this kind of a really large sort of general population of these Rhipsalis Floccosa, but there's not a whole lot of them in cultivation, which is kind of interesting. The plant that I have in front of me, I did not buy underneath that name. I bought it under the name Rhipsalis Floccosa subspecies Pittieri. Pittieri is not a subspecies of Floccosa anymore, so it is the only plant in my collection that I think could even possibly be Rhipsalis Floccosa subspecies Pulvingera. Don't really know though. And the only reason why I kind of wonder about that is because of these rather large knobs at the joints. That's the only real reason why I think maybe, but I've never really seen this one. I think if you do some searching for this one, you can find pictures of it. But it's kind of far and few in between. Again, it's really kind of hard to find. Apparently, the branches are supposed to turn red in high light. I don't know if I have any Rhipsalis Floccosa in my collection where that is the case. So, you know, again, I think we're going to have to go with the rarity classification on this one. We're not going to go with your firstborn child because I do think that this one is obtainable. I do think this one is a little bit more cultivated. So I think we're going to go for rare on this one. I think if you reached out to private collectors, that kind of thing, chances are you could probably find this one. Next up, we have Rhipsalis Floccosa subspecies Tucumanensis. Now, Tucumanensis is probably, outside of Rhipsalis Floccosa subspecies Floccosa, Tucumanensis is probably the other subspecies that you could find. I still think we're going to have to go maybe between rare and uncommon with that one. That it might be the one we have in front of us. It might not. I'm not really sure. But, you know, again, it's going to have this kind of like long sort of bucatini-ish sort of branches that are going to cascade down into a really beautiful plant. And like I said, Rhipsalis Floccosa has gorgeous, gorgeous flowers. So they're a little bit larger than most other Rhipsalis and really interesting looking. Next up, we have Rhipsalis gobelliana. Now, unfortunately, this one has had some issues. It's had some issues because somewhere along the way, this plant that we see in the background here ended up getting confused and somehow distributed fairly widely under the name Rhipsalis gobelliana. And so unfortunately, if you try to find Rhipsalis gobelliana, you're more likely to find that one than Rhipsalis gobelliana. So this is the Rhipsalis gobelliana that I know, the one that I've seen described, and the one that I see in most sort of scientific publications. And there's a couple of things that are really noticeable about Rhipsalis gobelliana. Like, one, these branches, they're kind of they have a strange feeling to them. It's kind of like this weird, thick kind of succulence. It's almost like dried wax. Two is that it's usually pretty easy to identify even without the blooms and stuff because of the color. It's like this olive green color. It's like a light sort of funky green. It doesn't really turn that kind of dark green at all. And then the branches, a lot of times they have a tendency to both kind of lobe outward and they kind of, I guess, cut inward a little bit. So you can see this here. They kind of look a little bit like holly. Sometimes, not always. Like, you can see this one is one that I imported from Germany, and you can see this one's a little bit different. And this one has branches that are maybe a little bit wavier. It's not really rooted yet, but you can see that same sort of olive green color. So those are some ways that you can tell this one apart. And I think for the rarity classification on this one, it is something that you can get. You know, obviously I found this one in the United States and I had to import that one in from Germany. But the issue with it is that in the United States, if I do a search for it, I'm more likely to find that plant. So because of that, we need to go for the rarity classification. I think we need to go in between rare and uncommon for this one, leaning much much closer to rare. It is a little bit tough to get, and you will have to do a little bit of work. You won't get it from any kind of a commercial nursery type thing, so you will need to do some extra work. I think, you know, every once in a while it might come up on Etsy or eBay, but it's more likely that you're going to have to do, you know, go the Facebook route, do an in-search job, get it from a private collection, or import it. Next up, we have Rhipsalis grandiflora. So Rhipsalis grandiflora also grows in Brazil. Rhipsalis grandiflora has pretty grand flowers. I'm guessing that's where the name came from, because it's very floriferous and it has very sort of larger flowers for Rhipsalis. And here in front of us, we have two different ones. I did a video on this. So we have the typical sort of Rhipsalis grandiflora, and then a different plant that was at one time classified as this species, Rhipsalis hadrosoma, which has since been reduced to a synonym of Rhipsalis grandiflora. And you can see that there is somewhat of a difference in their habit. In terms of rarity for this plant, I think that we probably are going to need to go with, I would say, uncommon. So I do think that this plant is out there. I do think that you can get it. I do think you can get it under either name. I think it's easier to get it if you import it. However, I have seen it. So, like, you know, I have seen it come up on eBay or Etsy. I do think you could easily get it if you did an in-search of post on Facebook. So yeah, I think we'll go with uncommon in this one. I hope that you've enjoyed going through the genus Rhipsalis and doing the rarity classification with me. And hopefully in some way, if you're a Rhipsalis collector or you're wanting to be a Rhipsalis collector, this video has helped you. Thank you for watching, and happy cacti growing.